So, hello, good afternoon. Welcome to everybody to this Wiener Holocaust Library and German History Society event. I'm Barbara Warnock from the Wiener Holocaust Library, from where I am joining you today. And we're really delighted that Neil Gregor agreed to speak to us about this really important topic of what did ordinary Germans know about the Holocaust, something that I know is of great interest to many people and a question often asked of us at the library. I'm going to hand over to Neil in just a moment, and we'll be hearing from him, and then there'll be plenty of time at the end for any questions. So could I ask you to put any questions that you've got into the chat, and then we'll try and get through as many of those as we can at the end. Yes, our talk today is on the subject of what did ordinary Germans know about the Holocaust. And we're going to be hearing from Professor Neil Gregor, and he's Professor of Modern European History at the University of Southampton and Director of the Parks Institute. He has published widely on diverse aspects of Nazi Germany, including Daimler-Benz in the Third Reich and Haunted City, Nuremberg and the Nazi Past, both of which won the Wiener Library's Fraenkel Prize for Contemporary History. He's also published How to Read Hitler. His book on the Symphony Concert in Nazi Germany is forthcoming with Chicago University Press. So we look forward to that. So I'll hand over now to Neil. I think he's got some images and slides to share with you as well.
Yeah, wonderful. Okie doke. Right, well, thank you, Barbara, and thanks so much for the invitation and for setting this up. You know, the Wiener Library is always a very kind of special place to speak, whether it's in person or at a distance. So it's a real pleasure to be here, and it's a particular pleasure that we're doing this in collaboration with the German History Society, which is an organisation that is equally close to my own heart. So I thought, since this is meant to be a sort of general talk for interested general listeners, I would pick a question which comes up, as Barbara says, again and again. What did ordinary Germans know about the Holocaust? And I want to start with a couple of grainy stills from the United States War Department film from 1945, Todesmühlen, or Death Mills. Death Mills is quite a well-known film, I think, or its existence is well known. It was aimed at confronting Germans and showing the rest of the world the crimes that had been committed in the Nazi era. And it works by showing footage of German civilians being shown around the concentration camp Buchenwald, which is near Weimar, shortly after liberation. So this is what the stills show you. And the film itself was then shown to Germans in cinemas around Germany in 1945. Now, the voiceover, let me just move the slide on. Yeah, there we are. The voiceover, it lays the blame at the door of the Nazi elite. These Germans, the ones who said they didn't know, were responsible insofar as they gladly put themselves into the hands of criminals and lunatics. Yeah, they tell you now that they know nothing or could do nothing even if they knew. Okay, so while emphasizing that ordinary Germans bore the moral responsibility for what had happened, you'll notice that the voiceover indulges the popular distinction between everyday Germans and the criminals and lunatics who were directly responsible. I think there's a sense in which the reported speech, they'll tell you that they knew nothing, implies a degree of distance to those German voices and a bit of ambivalence and skepticism. But nonetheless, the film gives substantial space to the idea that many, if not most, Germans had not known. And if you watch the film, it's the shocked faces of ordinary Germans that one sees throughout it, as much as the nature of the voiceover itself, that I think works to convey a very clear sense that most civilians were being confronted with the reality of what had happened for the first time. So my simple question today is really, was this the case? What did ordinary Germans know about terror, persecution, and genocide, and how did they know? And as I say, I've understood this as a kind of informal workshop style talk, really, rather than a very formal lecture. So I've just chosen 3 or 4 sources around which I'll try to talk as a way of thinking about how we might go about answering this question and gesture towards what the beginnings of a likely answer might look like. So the first thing to say is that ordinary Germans knew about the terror system from 1933 onwards because the regime was constantly trying to tell them about it. So what I'm showing here is the front cover of the Illustrierte Beobachter, the Illustrated Observer from December 1936. The Illustrierte Beobachter was the illustrated glossy sister publication of the main party newspaper, the Völkische Beobachter. And as you see, it's using all the sensationalizing techniques of the commercial mass media with which we're familiar today. It doesn't feel that different. And if it doesn't feel that different, well, maybe that's the point. Yeah? Essentially, one of the best known mass media organs of the time is leading with a cover story foregrounding the uniformed, shaven, marching inmates of the first and one of the most notorious of the concentration camps. Now, the point of the news story, of course, is not to draw shocked attention to the horror of what was happening inside Dachau. The point, rather, from the perspective of those writing, was to tell good, decent, ordinary members of the people's community that the political, the racial, the social outsiders of the nation had been safely quarantined away, that they'd been put in a place where they'll learn discipline, hard work, the value of integration into the community, and those who show themselves incapable of integrating themselves and rehabilitating themselves will not be let out. If I show you a couple more of the details from the centerfold, you get a further sense of how this works. In the first one, you can see a troop of armed SS guards on one side, and you can see an individual sentry manning a machine gun in a guard tower on the other. That makes clear enough, I think, the ways in which the threat of violence hangs over the prisoners. And if I move to another page, you can see how the prisoners are being cast in a certain light. These aren't neutral portraits, obviously. There's a clear link on offer to the reader between physical imperfection, moral degeneracy, and political unreliability. These people in the argument of the images, in the argument of the photo essay, are a threat. And the fact that, to me, the fact that such literature can circulate so openly and so widely gives us perhaps starting points for thinking about the ways in which these images might chime with the values of the readership and not just those of the editors. Okay. So to come back to that juxtaposition of, quotes, ordinary Germans and, quotes, criminals and lunatics in the 1945 film, we might here have starting points in these sort of mass circulation publications for thinking about how the values of the former and the values of the latter might not, in fact, be quite so far apart as that film was implying. Okay. Now, although Dachau did contain Jewish prisoners, some of whom were murdered from the outset, this was a concentration camp that mainly held political prisoners, prisoners from the left, social outsiders, people like the homeless or the allegedly work-shy, resistors, and during the war, many foreigners too. The largest category of inmate in Dachau after 1939 is in fact Polish inmates, Polish Catholic inmates. So although tens of thousands of people died in what was a brutally murderous environment, it wasn't an extermination camp in the manner of Auschwitz. So it doesn't quite answer my question about what Germans know about the Holocaust, as it were. So let me now show a couple of examples from the wartime and the Holocaust itself. The first is very well known, and I dig it up really by way of underlining that sometimes the answer has in fact been staring us in the face for quite some time. It's the famous affidavit by Hermann Gregor at the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg in 1946, and it describes a mass shooting very, very vividly. And it's often used to convey the horror of the so-called Holocaust by bullets. So you will, for example, find this in the Noakes and Pridham collection, which is where I first encountered it as an undergraduate. So if I read this part of the testimony, on 5th October 1942, when I visited the building office in Dubno, which is in Ukraine, my foreman told me that in the vicinity of the site, Jews from Dubno had been shot in 3 large pits, each about 30 meters long and 3 meters deep. About 1,500 persons had been killed daily. All were to be liquidated. As the shootings had taken place in his presence, he was still very upset. Monikas, that's his foreman, and I went straight to the pits. Nobody prevented us. I heard a quick succession of shots from behind one of the mounds of earth. And he goes on to give this, incredibly kind of distressing account of the mass killings. So this kind of testimony has, I think, traditionally been used to focus on the murderousness of the killing itself. But to me, it's worth pondering the presence of the witness. In terms of witnessing and in terms of knowledge, of course, the first and largest group of witnesses in this account are those who are doing the shooting themselves. But I do think it's worth taking the presence of Hermann Gregor, this German engineer for a building firm, along with his foreman, as a starting point for thinking about how many civilian Germans end up in the East as well. These two are there in the East as civilian contractors, as employees of a big building corporation. They're undertaking construction projects on behalf of the Wehrmacht, and they stand, I think, for the presence of very large numbers of German civilians. If we move through the testimony a little, he repeats, I was surprised that I was not ordered off, but I saw that there were 2 or 3 postmen in uniform nearby. Already the batch was approaching. They went down into the pit, lined themselves up against previous victims and were shot. And again, it's incredibly harrowing to read. But for my purposes today, I'm curious to register the presence of the 2 or 3 postmen. The fact that there's 2 or 3 of them together suggests to me that they are probably German rather than local postmen. So again, we're looking at civilian Germans who are present in the killing fields. And again, it's interesting to register that they're not moved on. There seems to be very little concern to keep this killing action secret. And I think that the more we understand that anti-Semitism was a broadly anchored social and emotional disposition in German society, the more we recognize the underlying political and ideological consensus that gives this people's community its cohesion, the less it really makes sense to expect anyone to have felt the need to hide anything. The implicit shared assumption here is that everybody accepts what is going on. Now, what this doesn't tell us about still is what civilians on the home front know. So let me move to a different example and a different kind of source, which is photography. And here you see a now well-known photo of German Jews being marched through the streets of Würzburg, which is a sort of medium-sized city in southern Germany, in Franconia. They're being marched to the main train station to be deported to their deaths eastwards. Well, what can we do with this image? The first thing I would point out is just to look at the shortness of everybody's shadows. Look at what time of day this is taking place. It's more or less midday, I should think. It's broad, sunny daylight in the middle of the street. Now, to the left of the image, you can see various passers-by going about their daily business. Now, there doesn't seem to be any concern to move them on here either. To the right, watching the procession, you can see a figure in a helmet, so a member of some kind of a militarized formation. But if you look at the main uniformed participants in the deportation, they're represented by the figure in the road looking back at the camera. There's a number of such figures lining the route you can just about make out, and they're ordinary policemen. They remind us of just how wide the range of agencies was that participated directly in the murder process. So put more bluntly, yet again, one of the key reasons why we can safely say that very many ordinary Germans knew about the Holocaust is that very many ordinary Germans were directly involved in organizing it and implementing it. But if I show you another image of the same deportation, if you now look at the top right of the image, I think you can see much more clearly just how many people are stopping to watch. The deportation is clearly a spectacle, okay? And let me, on these kinds of source, just show you one more. This is a different deportation. This one is the deportation of Sinti and Roma from Asberg, which is in southwest Germany. This is from 1940, and this is Sinti and Roma being deported to a transit camp pending their deportation to be killed eastwards. Again, you can see the fact of this happening in broad daylight in front of people who are out on their daily rounds, stopping to observe what's happening. And it just reminds us that the fact that this happens in broad daylight is clearly not unusual, as it were. It seems to be reasonably typical. So that gives you a couple of starting points for thinking about how much ordinary Germans knew about the deportations from Germany during the war. But again, I think it still leaves the question of how much these people knew about what was happening at the other end. Again, we can only gesture towards an answer. I want to do so by looking at Auschwitz itself. Picking up on what I've said, we can keep reminding ourselves that the Germans who most obviously know what was happening were those who were directly involved. And so it's worth asking, first of all, how many Germans saw service, if that's the right word, in Auschwitz during the war? And the answer to that is roughly 6,000. So I think you only have to think about 6,000 men going on leave, talking to friends, to family, to colleagues, writing letters, chatting away to whoever, to realize that the knowledge of whatever was happening may not have circulated uniformly, but it will quickly have become quite widespread. Now that said, I think it pays us to think a bit harder about where it is spreading from, to whom it is spreading, by whom it is being spread, and via what routes. So that gets us to what I think is an interesting and often underappreciated topic, and that is the location, the geographical location of Auschwitz itself. if we look at a map of today, you can see that it's located firmly in Poland, just between Katowice and Krakow. So for orientation, Berlin is right at the top left of the image, northwest. South from there, you come to Dresden, a bit more south, Prague, and then if you head towards more or less where the Czech Republic, present-day Slovakia and Poland meet, just north of there, you come to Oswiecim. Right? So, as kind of everybody knows, in inverted commas, it's in Poland. But if we move to the post 45 era, I think that has a certain kind of implications for how people think about what Auschwitz had represented after the war. That historians have had to work quite hard to roll back in recent years. If you try to place yourself in the position of Germans after 1945, particularly the majority of those who lived in post-war West Germany, the bit which is shaded light blue in the map on the right, you can see how very swiftly ordinary Germans would have been able to convince themselves that the genocide had taken place in these sealed off spaces deep in Eastern Europe, far behind the Iron Curtain that now marks the boundary between East and West, and in remote places to which the overwhelming majority of Germans had had no access, and of which they'd had no knowledge. Very quickly, the Holocaust started to feel like something that had happened a long way away. Figuratively and literally, it feels very remote. And I do think it's quite interesting to look at what Auschwitz looked like in the 1950s compared to what it looked like now, and to get a sense of how kind of neglected and marginal a space it occupied in most people's memories, wherever they were. So the but here is that if we look at a simple map of Central Europe during the war, we can register a simple, but as I say, I think still unappreciated or underappreciated fact, and that is that Auschwitz was located on territory that was administratively German during the war. So in yellow, you see the outlines of pre-war Poland, which incorporates the town of Oswiecim, Auschwitz, but it's in the area shaded beige that was annexed directly to Germany in 1939. So here we can ask, well, so what? Always a helpful question. So what? What does this tell us? Well, to me, it has very profound consequences for what kind of German we might expect to find in Auschwitz, the town, between 1939 and 1945. Because it was incorporated directly into Germany, it was not just the SS and not just the military who moved in. It was the entire range of German civilian administrators. The same civil service and local government structures that existed in the rest of Germany were established there too. And of course, these administrators took their children, for example, who needed schooling. So that meant the establishment of German schools and kindergartens, all of which needed staffing. All of those people wanted restaurants and pubs to go to unwind in evenings, which meant that entrepreneurial Germans moved in to take over as publicans or to work as waiters, and so on. And the list goes on. Dentists, doctors, nurses, you name it, they all moved to Oswiecim. So within a short period of time, Auschwitz became a German town with all that this entailed. And when all those SS men I mentioned were off duty and came into town for a drink to unwind, they had plenty of people to talk to. And as the beer and schnapps flowed, of course, they talked about what they were doing. Now, these people in turn, of course, they move around. They rotated, they got leave, they went back to Germany, they moved elsewhere in the occupation. The point here, I think, is that during a war, people are actually unusually mobile. and they take their knowledge with them. So just one very small passing example of this from the work that Barbara mentioned that I've been doing on musical life in Germany during the National Socialist period that I've just finished writing. As Barbara says, I've been writing a book on the Symphony Concert on Nazi Germany, which is basically about middle-class Germans going to the concert hall to listen to Beethoven or Brahms or whatever it is on a Monday night. And on the face of it, the topic seems as far removed from Auschwitz within the sort of context of studying Nazi Germany as you could possibly get. But one of the orchestras I've looked at is the Silesian Philharmonic Orchestra, which was based in Breslau. So if I quickly come back to this map, Breslau is present-day Wrocław, right in the middle of the image here. And nowadays, to drive from Wrocław to Oswiecim might be about 3 hours in the car. Probably back then a little bit longer, no doubt, but it's local by most people's standards. Yeah. Now the Silesian Philharmonic Orchestra was basically a theatre orchestra, and in the files of this theatre, you find correspondence concerning visits of a theatre troupe from Breslau to go and entertain SS men inside the camp. Okay. Precisely what they saw when they visited is, of course, unclear, but they will have seen and heard enough. So these are not members of any kind of military or uniformed formation that have anything even indirectly to do with the killing as such. They are members of the institutions of civil society, a theatre, and they're going all the way in to the biggest killing centre in Europe at the time. So in this way, if I wrap up, the genocide very quickly became, I think, the open secret of German society. If I come back to my photo of German Jews being deported from their city of origin, it's no surprise then that we have anecdotal evidence of women in Berlin standing in the street with their shopping bags in their hands saying they're off to be gassed too. And if I then come right back round to my starting point, the American educational film of 1945, I think we might conclude that when the United States authorities tried to convince Germans of what had happened during the Nazi period, they're only really reminding Germans of that which they already knew all too well. And that's where I'll stop. Many thanks for listening.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Neil. That was fantastic, really thought-provoking. Yes, and I was looking at that map just there. That's quite interesting to see the sort of the borders juxtaposed like that in that way. And yes, obviously, so often people talk about Auschwitz or Chełmno and other camps as being in German-occupied Poland, but that fails to take account of the fact that a couple of them are in Greater Germany, of course. So that's really fascinating. I've just asked everybody if they could put any questions in the chat. So we've got a few come in, but just to give people a bit more chance to sort of think of that. I just had a couple of quick questions. So one of them was just, I was interested to know the image that you had of Roma and Sinti being deported from Auschwitz. Where is that image from? As in, who took it?
I don't know is the answer to that. It's one I came across in passing while looking at these ones, which I believe are in the police files, the Gestapo files. And in the course of, being intrigued by that and sort of flicking around, I came across reference to this one too, but I don't actually know.
Right. Yes, it's quite striking. It almost looks like it could be from moving footage. A still from moving footage, but anyway, I just was interested.
I think it's, it raises a good question that the reasons people might take photographs vary, of course.
Yes,
In the in this one, I think it's reasonably clear that it's being documented by the police themselves, uh,
yes,
because it's just so, there's nothing clandestine about the way in which it's taken in the face of one of the policemen, as it were. Here it's less obvious. Um,
yes. It is. Yes, it's not. It's quite intriguing.
yeah.
And I've not seen anything like that before, so I was just quite intrigued.
Yeah.
We've got lots of questions coming, so I'll set aside my second question for now, and I'll go to some of the questions. David's asking where ordinary Germans thought Jewish people, or obviously in the case of this group from Asperger's syndrome Roma, but where people went when they abruptly disappeared from their neighbourhoods in this way.
I'm sure the answer to that is it varies. There's enough evidence that awareness of the camps is making its way, via sort of resistance news networks and other forms of communication abroad, in quite some detail, in fact, to leave us feeling that it's unlikely that ordinary German civilians on the home front were any more ignorant than that. Okay. And for those who knew how to decode the language of the media during the war, I think it's becoming increasingly clear that the regime was addressing what you might think of as implicit or tacit knowledge on the part of ordinary Germans who already realized. So I guess the most notorious example is the film The Eternal Jew. I think if one watches that, it superficially, there's no direct mention of where anyone is going or what is happening. But I don't think the film makes a lot of sense unless one assumes that there's shared knowledge between the filmmakers and the film viewers. Okay. The challenge, of course, is always that one senses that the knowledge is there, but it's not always explicitly articulated.
Yeah.
And so one is looking for a kind of an implied reader in the text when a media organ talks about the sort of resettlement of Jews eastwards. If you read that in a sort of crudely literary or literal fashion, you could say, well, all right, all ordinary German civilians know is that they're being shunted off somewhere vaguely eastwards. Yeah. But I think that the more that we take the view that the sort of forms of communication are more open and varied in Nazi Germany, the more we assume that there are sort of reservoirs of knowledge out there in German society, the more I think we would have to conclude that that language of resettlement is actually understood by everybody in a more detailed sense, right? In a more explicit sense. That
Isn't
everybody
that
knows.
maybe to overestimate the extent to which people think things through in detail? Lots of people, they even if you stopped and looked at a group being deported, how much would you really consciously think through what you were witnessing or what the implications were in detail?
Well, you're right, and I'm talking quite sweepingly. Okay. And whatever knowledge does percolate through German society doesn't percolate uniformly. I mean, I think that's I would, if nothing else, I think if I were trying to draw distinctions, I think in small town rural Germany, where most people, by 1941 haven't seen a Jew for 3 or 4 years, you're going to have a sort of slightly different dynamic to people who live in the center of Berlin. Seen these roundups several times, taking place in, in open daylight, like I was trying to describe. So yes, I mean, one has to, leave room for a little bit of texture and a little bit of considering about how people process knowledge and how they think through the implications of what they're witnessing. But I guess the thing I would caution against is assuming that people on the home front, if you like, and people in the killing fields are two different sets of people, because they're not. People move backwards and forwards, and that sort of analytical distinction between people who last see or hear of anything in the marketplace in their town square, and then people who are out doing the killing in the killing fields itself, that has become increasingly blurred, I think, amongst historians over the last, I don't know, decade or two.
Yes, that's a really good point. So just to sort of turn to a couple more questions. I mean, this Robert's question is kind of related, but maybe not quite on the point of kind of what wider German society knew. But he's asking what if you're aware of what proportion of German soldiers refuse to kill or refuse to take part in mass killings. I don't know if it's really sort of quantifiable.
Probably not, right? I think, if nothing else, it depends who you are understanding by German soldiers. Yeah, whether you are using that as a catch-all for all the members of the SS killing squads as well, and all the policemen, this quotes ordinary policemen, as well as ordinary German soldiers, members of the Wehrmacht, all of who are involved in the killing in slightly different ways and to a slightly different extent. I think the most compelling starting points for thinking that question through, for me, much as I actually disagree with quite a lot of the argument of the book, is Browning's Ordinary Men, where he describes in very sort of vivid and thoughtful detail the interpersonal dynamics of a group of about 150 policemen who are set the task of killing in the kinds of killing actions that I referred to with Gregor's testimony. And I think he comes to the conclusion that amongst these policemen, it's roughly 20%. Most of them don't outright refuse in that kind of moral gesture, but they find ways of getting out of it. And, as Browning famously argues, they don't get into any trouble for this. They just get sort of told, okay, well, you can go over there and do some paperwork, and you can go over there and stand guard, and you can be, cook for the day, and, you can do something else. And he uses that as a kind of backdoors argument to talk about the willingness of the other 80% to do it, basically. And that feels to me as an account of the sort of dynamics of a group of men placed in this environment. That feels reasonably compelling to me, I have to say. Whatever else one might find to disagree with in the book. Yes,
thank you. Yeah. So again, sort of turning to a sort of slightly different theme in a sense. Nancy's actually asking if you'd seen the recent film Zone of Interest, whose director is actually a trustee of the Wiener Library, Jonathan Glazer. And I suppose it does kind of make some of the points that you have, in the sense that it shows, the kind of families moving to the sites of killing very much. So I don't know if you've seen it or if you had any comments or reflections on it from the perspective of this theme.
No, I haven't, I'm afraid. It's on my list of things to do.
Yes.
And things to see.
Yes.
So, and if the short answer is I don't know, it's usually best not to try a long one. So
yes, yeah, no, if you haven't seen it, I think it'd be a bit hard to comment, definitely. And then Peter's asking what you think of the idea that the Nazis, particularly Goebbels, propagated an open secret that made the wider German public complicit in order to make them fight harder against the advancing Soviets.
yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's the question of why Germans keep fighting in 1944-45 on the Eastern Front is an incredibly difficult one, I think. But if one opens it up, one can find one's way into some quite interesting fundamental questions about Nazi Germany. Yeah. I think it's partly the ordinary Germans who are now the soldiers on that front have internalized images of the enemy. Okay, they believe that the sort of Asiatic Bolsheviks are subhuman murderers who are coming for their women and children, and that keeps them fighting. Against that, I suspect that there's also, by this point, if my wider argument today is true as well, that Germans on the Eastern Front know what is coming to them, basically because they know what they've done. Yeah? They know that there is going to be no mercy because of the appalling crimes that they know themselves to have committed in the East themselves. Yeah? Now, many of the people who commit or actually possibly most of the soldiers who committed the mass shootings in 1941 are probably dead by 1944, 45. So we're not necessarily talking about the same people, but there is, nonetheless, the kind of scorched earth policy of the Wehrmacht in 1944, 45, which is, brutal and vicious in the extreme. So that's also a reason to keep fighting. I think, just as a final one on that, and I don't necessarily know the answer to this, but I think it's an interesting question, is that it rests the assumptions of, in the sort of the idea that Peter is sort of putting on the table for us, that there's something particular about Germans fighting on the Eastern Front, sort of rests on an image of the fighting on the Western Front, which I also think that military historians have started to revise slightly. It seems very, very clear that actually, contrary to what we perhaps used to think, that the German army fights on viciously and brutally in the West as well. Yeah? And you can't explain that by kind of anti-Bolshevism, as it were. So there's something more complex going on, which might be about the more general buy-in of broad sections of the Wehrmacht and young German men, and certainly their officers, into the broad sort of emotional consensus that underpins the people's community. Yeah. So, again, it's complex. There's something in it, but it's perhaps not all of it.
Okay, thank you. And then we've got a question here relating to the kind of the point of what people in the West knew, or what I guess the populations, Allied populations, perhaps people in Britain and America knew. And I certainly know from in the library's collections, we've got a pamphlet that was published by the Polish government in exile in early 1943, relaying the contents of a statement they'd made to the embryonic UN about mass extermination of Jews in German-occupied Poland lands. And that statement provoked a big debate in the House of Parliament. There was widespread newspaper coverage. And we had a talk a few years ago by the then director of the House of the Wannsee Conference, in which she went through all of the different newspaper reports in London and New York about mass killings of Jews. So I guess what I've always concluded from that is that if you were paying attention, you could have known quite a bit. But I don't know, Neil, if you want to sort of add any more to that.
Well, only to say, I mean, I agree with you. The killings are, I believe, discussed in the House of Commons in late 1942.
Yes.
News certainly finds its way, in remarkable detail, doesn't it, to the Foreign Office.
Yes.
And that then generates its own debates about, well, what do you want the Foreign Office or the German government, the British government, to do about that? But in terms of knowledge itself, I think it's pretty well established, isn't it, that it was there. The Manchester Guardian, today's Guardian, reports on the existence of Auschwitz again in fairly good detail, fairly accurate detail, I should say. But before the end of 1942, if I remember rightly. So it's not just that the knowledge makes its way through the corridors of power. It's also out there in wider civil society. Now, you can obviously ask questions, as always, about how much of anyone's newspaper anyone reads and how much sense they make of it. Whether they just sort of gloss over it or really linger on it and think about the implications. So the history of what we'd call knowledge formation is complex, right?
Yes.
But those basic flows of information towards people who are in a position to process it, government, civil service, and so on, that's well established, I think.
Yes. And actually, the Wiener Library at the time was publishing a thing called Jewish News, which isn't the same as the Jewish News newspaper now, but it reported on Auschwitz camp, which it was calling Auschwitz, very, very early. So yes, again, the information was circulating. So just turning to the questions and comments. Pierre's just commenting that I think he's talking maybe about Alina Berta, who collects photos of deportations. I know that we've also had a talk at the library by Christoph Kreutzmüller, which I think might be available online if people are sort of interested in the wider topic of deportations and the photography around deportations. There's other research about that, and I think a talk by Christoph Kreutzmüller. Okay, so Finley's asking so coming back to the original film, the Death Mills film, do you think then that the reactions of the Germans in the film were staged, given they did really likely know what was happening? Yes.
It's a good question, isn't it? I'm not sure we're in a position to answer that. There is quite a lot of scholarship on this film, its background and how it was made, and anybody who's made a film, whether it's a big feature film or just something quite amateur, knows that you get your footage and you edit it and you can make it do whatever work you want. So the kind of, how can I put it, the sort of the emotional tug of Todesmühlen is an effect which the Americans are seeking to create. And of course, they're building the sort of visual argument or deploying that footage in a manner that, does that kind of work for the film, if you like. So you'd have to, for a comment beyond that, I think you'd have to go to film historians, really, who are used to working with this stuff in rather more subtle ways than I am, to be honest. Just as I think, one or two of the questions I can see in the chat about photography point us in the direction of the ways in which the history of photography has actually become quite a big sort of subfield in Holocaust studies and indeed in history generally recently, so that our readings of these images I think with the help of those historians of photography, have become a lot more sort of subtle and critical than they were, 20 years ago, let's say. Mm.
Yes. And I think so. There's a few comments, as you say, about photography. There's also a couple of mentions of personal testimony. So Claire is talking about correspondence between her German Jewish grandmother and a non-Jewish old friend in 1942, which and quotes it, you do not know what they're doing to us, and asks about the use of sort of personal testimonies in trying to understand this topic. And then there's a comment, I think, from Erica, who's mentioned that she'd be interested to read eyewitness accounts by non-Jewish Germans in Nazi Germany. We may have some of those, Erica, in the Wiener Library's collection, so it might be worth investigating that. We've got a huge collection of eyewitness accounts, 1,300 or something, so it might be there's probably something relevant there. But yes, Neil, I don't know if you want to comment on this idea of personal correspondence or individual testimony or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've massively expanded our sense of what, quotes, the archive is over the last 20 years, haven't we? And so the kind of correspondence that Claire's referring to feels to me to be, very much at the center of how people are trying to work on the way in which knowledge is formed and communicated. Yeah. So letters that Claire's referring to, I would think, for example, of the work of Shirley Gilbert, which is, a super thoughtful, I think, looking at batches of correspondence between members of a family who are dispersed around the world by the events of the Holocaust. Joachim Schleur has also written some very interesting stuff on letters. There's also, a lot more work done these days, and a lot more willingness to sort of, think critically and creatively about the contents of diaries than used to be the case. I think that, an earlier generation of sort of, published diaries used to sort of just use those diaries as a way of kind of just documenting the fact of something having happened, bearing witness in a kind of, countering denial kind of way. But my sense is that a younger generation of historians are doing far more subtle work on the nature of the diary itself as a source. Likewise with the letters, people like Charlie Knight are doing incredibly clever work, I think, on that kind of source. So my sense is that we have a sort of generation of students, particularly doctoral students, coming up who are actually working with those kinds of ego documents, as we call them, in far more subtle and creative ways than was the case 20, 30 years ago, when you might just take an extract from a diary and just say, well, look, that's what happened. Yeah. And that's a good thing. I mean, it's a very positive advance.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. So we've got time just for one more question. So I'm just going to go to David, who's asked a question about whether there were any was any sort of protest or condemnation in church sermons about the deportation of and killing of Jews. And I suppose perhaps he's got in mind the way that there were such things in relation to the so-called euthanasia program, which then kind of drove the mass killings of disabled people at kind of underground, really, whereas it had been more public before that point. So yes, I'm not quite sure on that question. Are you aware of anything like that?
Not to my knowledge. I mean, I think David is thinking of the Bishop of Munster, isn't he? Whose name momentarily, Bishop Garland.
Yeah.
Garland, who famously sort of speaks out against the euthanasia and is famously kind of silent in the same testimonies, as it were, about the deportations of Jews. And indeed, if you look at it more closely, you find out that from first to last, he's a pretty unpleasant anti-Semite. I'm not aware of anything in the form of church sermons, anything as explicit as that, let's say. I think what it would be worth doing would be to go to parish newsletters and look at the sort of sotto voce critiques that some churchmen might be offering in the readings, in the Bible readings that they suggest for their flock on a daily and weekly basis. I was very struck when in a former project, you know, I worked on the history of Nuremberg after 1945 and was trying to think a little bit about the emotional landscapes of 1945 and the experience of defeat. And one of the sources I used was parish newsletters. And one of the things I just looked up was what Bible readings the local priests and pastors were suggesting on a weekly basis, because these people know the concerns of their flock and they address them through, you know, suggesting consoling readings for them. So in the post-war period, that's all about missing German soldiers and grieving and loss. But I would hazard a guess that if you went and looked at what pastors were suggesting their flock should read in 1942, 43, 44, you might find some allusions to war crimes and what's going on in the East. If I wanted to find religious critique, I mean Christian religious critique of what had been going on, that's the kind of slightly more subtle place I think I'd go looking.
There you go, research project for somebody.
Yeah,
yeah. No, that would be interesting. Yes, there was the Rosenstrasse protests by non-Jewish German wives whose husbands in Berlin, Jewish husbands, had been arrested, and there was an open protest about that. But yes, I've not particularly heard of sort of sermons or anything like that. But yes, well, Neil's got an interesting idea about how to get to that topic. So we're out of time. I'm just going to put in the chat a link to our events page, and you can have a look at what events, some of them will be online, are coming up. For those of you that are interested specifically in the education programme, we you can find out more online, and we do tours and at the library we do talks, we go into schools come in to us, universities come in, and we've also got an educational website, the Holocaust Explained. So there's lots of things that you can look at, lots of resources that we've got. So it just remains for me to thank Neil very, very much. That's a really thought-provoking presentation, and thank you for giving so much time to the Q&A as well, Neil. And thank you all for your attendance and for brilliant questions. And I hope to see you again at future library events. So just remains for me to say goodbye, everyone.